At my own wedding, my husband's family sat me at a table in the back with the catering staff, while his mother took my seat at the head table. I smiled through it because I refused to cry on my wedding day. Then the head caterer knelt beside my chair, pressed a folded napkin into my hand, and whispered, "Read this before the toasts. Trust me." That bride was Rachel. The groom was Joshua. And the woman who orchestrated everything, the seating, the humiliation, the smug smile from the head table, was his mother, Patricia. What Rachel didn't know yet was that this was not just about a chair. Patricia had been telling vendors and guests for weeks that the marriage was temporary, and she had a legal plan to prove it. Rachel met Joshua 3 years earlier at a charity gala in downtown Chicago. She was 26, a graphic designer at a small firm. He was 28, running the commercial real estate company his father had built from nothing. The connection was instant, the kind where you forget there are other people in the room. Within 6 months, they were inseparable. Within a year, he proposed. And within that same year, Patricia made it clear this marriage was a problem she intended to solve. Patricia had never approved. From the first dinner, Rachel felt it. The questions about her modest background, the comparisons to Joshua's ex-girlfriend, a lawyer from a prominent family. But this was deeper than disapproval. There was something else at stake. Joshua's father, Arthur, had died 2 years before the wedding, leaving behind a trust valued at $7 million. The family estate in Lake Forest, a portfolio of commercial properties, investment accounts. Arthur had structured the trust to pass jointly to Joshua and his future spouse upon marriage. Patricia was the interim trustee. She controlled everything until Joshua wed, and once he did, that control would legally dissolve. So Patricia began a quiet campaign. She told wedding vendors that the engagement was unstable. She told extended family that Rachel was after the money. And she contacted a family attorney to explore whether an annulment could void the transfer of assets. All of this happened weeks before the invitations went out. When it came to the wedding, Patricia inserted herself into every detail. She offered to handle the rehearsal dinner, then the flowers, then the seating chart. Under the guise of helping, she took over the reception layout and approved a plan no one else saw. On the morning of the ceremony, Rachel was too busy to notice what Patricia had done. But the staff knew. They had been handed a revised seating chart 3 days earlier, a chart that moved the bride's name from the head table to a corner table near the kitchen door. Beside her place card, a note printed in italic script, "Thank you for your service." The ceremony was beautiful. The vows were genuine. Rachel walked back down the aisle with tears in her eyes, believing the hard part was over. Then she entered the reception hall. She saw her place card on that back table, next to a busboy. She saw Patricia sinking into the bride's chair at the head table, adjusting her corsage. And she understood. This was not a mistake. It was a declaration. Rachel smiled. She would not cry at her own wedding. She walked to that corner table, sat down beside the catering staff, and accepted what felt like defeat. Then the head caterer, a woman named Maria who had worked this family's events for over a decade, approached her table. Maria knelt beside her chair, pressed a folded napkin into her palm, and whispered, "Read this before the toasts. Trust me." Rachel unfolded the napkin with her heart hammering. Inside, written in blue pen on a torn piece of receipt paper, were 5 sentences. The note said, "Your mother-in-law has been telling every vendor, every planner, and half the guests that this marriage is a sham. She claims it won't last the year. She's already contacted a divorce attorney about an annulment strategy." "I have a photo of the document, Maria." Rachel read it twice. The noise of the reception, the clinking glasses, the laughter from the head table, the soft jazz from the band faded to a dull hum. She looked up at Patricia, seated in the white satin chair meant for the bride, raising a champagne glass to someone across the room, smiling, laughing. The woman who had just humiliated her in front of 200 guests was now acting like nothing had happened. But this was not just about a chair. This was about a premeditated campaign to erase her marriage before the ink on the license was dry. Maria reappeared beside her, holding a tray of empty glasses like a shield. "I've worked 12 family events for the Morrisons," she whispered. "Patricia talks to lawyers on the phone in the kitchen during cocktail hour. She assumes staff are invisible. I heard her 3 weeks ago, packing by the walk-in freezer, telling someone on the other end that the trust documents had a flaw. That if the marriage could be annulled within 60 days, Joshua would remain the sole beneficiary and she would stay on as trustee. Rachel's fingers went cold. The trust. Joshua had told her about it, vaguely. His father had set it up years ago, a way to protect the family assets from business creditors. But Joshua had never mentioned that the marriage itself was the trigger. Neither had Patricia, of course. And now the caterer, a woman they'd barely noticed at past family gatherings, was handing her the missing piece of a puzzle she didn't even know existed. "Show me the photo," Rachel said. Maria pulled a phone from her apron pocket. She swiped to a photograph and handed it over. Rachel stared at the screen. It was a legal document, a draft petition for annulment, addressed to the Cook County Circuit Court. The petitioner was Patricia Morrison, on behalf of her son. The grounds listed: fraud, misrepresentation of intent, induced marriage for financial gain. Rachel's name was there in black and white, accused of marrying Joshua solely to access the Morrison Trust. The date stamp on the draft was 2 days before the wedding rehearsal. Patricia hadn't just planned to humiliate her. She had planned to dismantle her reputation in a court of law. Rachel stood up. She would not scream. She would not cry. She scanned the room until she found Joshua, standing near the bar with his best man, laughing at something, oblivious. She walked toward him, the napkin folded in her fist, the phone behind her back. She touched his elbow. "I need you, right now, outside." Joshua saw her face. The laughter died. He followed her through the side doors onto the terrace overlooking the country club's garden. The evening air was warm, the sky streaked with amber and rose. Somewhere inside, a fork was tapping a glass for the toasts to begin. "You need to read this," she said, handing him the napkin. He read it. Then he read it again. His expression shifted from confusion to disbelief to something colder. "Is this real?" Rachel showed him the photo. He stared at his mother's signature on the draft petition, at the court header, at the words forged with legal precision to destroy his wife's character. His jaw locked. "I knew she didn't like you. I didn't know she was capable of this." Then Rachel told him what Maria had said about the trust. The 60-day annulment window. The trustee clause. Joshua went still, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then he pulled out his own phone and called the family attorney, the one his father had hired, not his mother's lawyer, and put the call on speaker. It took 4 minutes. The attorney confirmed that the trust had been structured by Arthur Morrison, so that upon Joshua's legal marriage, all assets would transfer into a joint marital trust with Joshua and his spouse as co-beneficiaries, and the interim trustee, Patricia, would be automatically removed. But there was a condition. If an annulment was filed within 60 days of the marriage and granted, the transfer would be voided. The assets would revert to the original trust, and Patricia would remain trustee indefinitely. "She's trying to keep the money," Rachel said, her voice barely a whisper. "No," Joshua said. "She's trying to keep control. Without the trust, she's just a retiree in a big house with no authority. With the trust, she's the matriarch of a $7 million legacy. And my marriage was the thing she couldn't control." He looked at Rachel, and in his eyes she saw something new, not just anger, but shame. His own mother had tried to legally sever his marriage before the cake was cut. The sound of a microphone crackled inside. The toasts were starting. Patricia's voice rang through the venue, smooth and rehearsed. "Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to this very special celebration." Rachel took Joshua's hand. "She has no idea we know." "No," he said, "but she's about to." They stepped back inside as Patricia's voice swelled, telling the room what a devoted son Joshua had always been. Rachel returned to her seat at the corner table. Joshua walked toward the head table, not to take the chair beside his mother, but to stand behind the guests, arms folded. Patricia saw him and her smile faltered for half a beat, then recovered. She finished her toast to polite applause. The best man stood, raising his glass, but Joshua stepped forward and took the microphone. "Before we continue," he said, "there's someone here who deserves recognition." He turned to the corner table. "Maria, would you come up here?" Maria walked forward, her apron still smudged from plating appetizers. Joshua put a hand on her shoulder. "Maria has worked our family events for 12 years. She's seen things most people in this room haven't. And tonight she did something for my wife that my own family chose not to do. She showed her the truth." He held up the napkin. The room went quiet. Patricia's expression didn't change, but her fingers tightened around the stem of her wine glass. Joshua read the napkin aloud, every word. Then he held up Maria's phone and displayed the photograph of the draft annulment petition, dated 2 days before the wedding, bearing his mother's signature. This is a legal document that my mother filed without my knowledge, without my consent, accusing Rachel of fraud and financial manipulation. My wife, on our wedding day." The gasps were audible. Patricia remained motionless. Then she did what lifelong manipulators do when cornered. She tried to flip the script. "This is a misunderstanding," she said, rising from the bride's chair. "That document was merely a precaution, for Joshua's protection. Every family of means takes such measures. I never intended to file it." "You did file it," came a voice from the back of the room. Everyone turned. A man in a gray suit stepped forward from the entryway, briefcase in hand. It was David Calloway, the Morrison family's estate attorney since Arthur's time. He had arrived during the ceremony at Joshua's request after that first phone call, just in case. He'd been waiting in the garden until called. Now he walked to the center of the room. "The draft was registered with the county clerk's office the morning of the wedding," Calloway said, producing a stamped copy. "I checked the docket on my way here. It's official. A filing date of 9:07 a.m. today. Patricia, you didn't just draft a petition. You initiated an annulment action the moment your son said I do." The room erupted. Patricia's face went white. Joshua did not flinch. He had expected this. Calloway's text had come through during Patricia's toast. But it was what Calloway said next that revealed the deeper scheme. "There's something else." He opened his briefcase and removed a thicker file. "I reviewed the full trust documents Arthur Morrison executed before his passing. As you all know, the trust passes to Joshua and his spouse upon marriage, with the interim trustee being removed. What no one knew, because Arthur sealed this provision, is there's a protective clause. If any person, including the interim trustee, attempts to annul the marriage for reasons found by a court to be fraudulent or malicious, that person forfeits any claim to the trust's assets and becomes personally liable for the legal fees and any financial losses incurred by the beneficiaries." Patricia's mouth opened. Calloway continued. "Arthur suspected that someone might try to undermine Joshua's marriage for financial gain, so he built a failsafe. Not only does the trust transfer immediately upon a malicious annulment attempt, but the trustee must return any assets she has already removed." He looked at Patricia. "We have records of a transfer of $800,000 from the trust account to a personal account in your name. That transfer occurred 3 months ago. Under the clause, that money must be returned with interest, and you have lost all standing as trustee." This was the twist Rachel and Joshua hadn't expected. It wasn't just about control. Patricia had already taken funds, banking on the annulment to cover her tracks before anyone audited the trust. If the marriage unraveled, she'd have kept the money and the trust intact under her thumb. If the annulment failed, she'd planned to return the funds quietly, claiming an accounting error. But she never anticipated being caught at the reception itself, with all the evidence laid out in front of 200 witnesses. Patricia's voice cracked. "That provision was never discussed. I was his wife." "You were his wife," Calloway replied. "But Arthur loved his son, and he loved the idea of a future daughter-in-law he'd never met. He wrote both of them into the trust's protection. He told me once, if Patricia ever tries to tear apart what I've built, make sure my son's marriage is the thing that stops her." He handed Joshua the trust document, the clause highlighted in yellow. Patricia turned to Joshua, hands out, palms up. "I did this for you. You'll see that one day." She looked at Rachel. "You'll see what she really is." But Joshua didn't answer. He took Rachel's hand and pulled her gently to her feet. He faced the room. "I'm sorry that your evening has turned into this. But I'm not sorry my wife now knows the truth. Maria, thank you." He looked at the caterer directly. "You did the right thing, and my wife and I will never forget it." He handed the microphone back to the band leader and walked with Rachel toward the exit, past the flower arrangements and the uneaten cake and the table where Patricia still stood, alone. Behind them, they heard the scrape of chairs as guests began to leave, and the hollow sound of a woman who had orchestrated everything and lost it all in the span of a single toast. But the final surprise was still waiting. Calloway had one more delivery, a sealed envelope pulled from his case. He handed it to Rachel as they reached the door. "From Arthur," he said. "He insisted that if a moment like this ever came, you should read this before you left the building." Rachel tore open the envelope on the country club steps, Joshua's arm around her shoulders. Inside was a single sheet of cream-colored paper, handwritten in black ink, Arthur Morrison's final words, composed 3 years before he died and entrusted to his attorney for exactly this moment. "My dear Rachel, Though I have not met you, I know you. Because my son would not choose a woman without spine, without heart, without the quiet strength to endure what I fear you will face. Patricia has been many things in our marriage, but a graceful mother-in-law was never in her nature. I suspected she would fight this marriage. I suspected she would stoop to the lowest tactics of control. So I built a wall around you both. The protective clause is my final gift. Use the trust to build a life together, not to maintain a legacy. And when you read this, know that you are exactly the woman I hoped Joshua would find. Welcome to the family. With love, Arthur. Rachel's hands were shaking. Joshua read it over her shoulder, and for the first time that night, his composure cracked. A single tear tracked down his cheek. His father had known. His father had planned for their happiness from beyond the grave. The following morning, David Calloway convened a meeting at his downtown office. Patricia was present, seated stiffly beside her own attorney. Joshua and Rachel sat across the table, still in their wedding clothes from the night before. Calloway read the terms aloud. Patricia Morrison was immediately removed as interim trustee. The $800,000 she had transferred was to be returned in full within 30 days, with interest accruing at the legal rate. Any further attempt to challenge the marriage or the trust would trigger automatic forfeiture of all family assets she still held, including the Lake Forest house, which Arthur had placed in a separate life, estate reverting to the trust upon her death. She was, in effect, a tenant in her own home. Patricia's attorney argued that the protective clause was punitive and possibly unenforceable. Calloway then produced a notarized letter from Arthur, attached to the trust documents, stating explicitly that he had drafted the clause with full understanding of his wife's potential actions, and that it represented his clear testamentary intent. The clause was ironclad. It had been reviewed by 3 judges prior to Arthur's death and sealed until triggered. Patricia had triggered it herself. As a final blow, Calloway informed Patricia that the annulment petition she had filed would likely be referred to the state bar for review, as her own attorney had filed a document containing knowingly false statements. The malpractice exposure alone would be significant. Patricia said nothing. She gathered her purse and walked out of the office without looking at her son. That afternoon, the story spread. Maria gave an interview to a local reporter, describing the moment she slipped Rachel the napkin, the years of watching Patricia mistreat staff and family, and the photograph that changed everything. The article ran with the headline, "Caterer Saves Bride from $1 million Betrayal." Maria's catering company received 200 booking inquiries within the week. She would later open a second location, funded in part by a generous gift from Rachel and Joshua. But the deepest resolution happened quietly, a week later at the cabin Arthur had built on Lake Geneva. Rachel and Joshua drove up alone. They sat on the dock in the late afternoon, watching the water reflect the pines. Joshua told Rachel that his father had built this place by hand, the same year he'd established the trust. Arthur had told him once, "Legacies don't matter if you don't have someone to share them with." Now, for the first time, Joshua understood what he meant. The marriage that Patricia had tried to annul before the wedding cake was cut had become legally unassailable. The trust was safely in their names. And Patricia, once the matriarch of a $7 million empire, was alone in a house that no longer belonged to her, surrounded by the silence of her own making. Rachel and Joshua stayed at the lake house for 3 days. On the last morning, Rachel unfolded Arthur's letter one more time and tucked it into the frame of a photograph on the mantel, a picture of Arthur and a young Joshua, holding fishing poles, smiling into the sun. She lit a candle beside it. It was, in its own way, a thank you note from a woman he never knew but somehow understood perfectly. The caterer's note was framed and hung in their kitchen. The annulment petition was stored in a safety deposit box, a reminder of what had almost been stolen from them and what a stranger's courage had helped them keep. And the marriage, it thrived, not in spite of that wedding day, but because of it. They had learned, in the most dramatic fashion possible, that they would always have each other's backs, and that sometimes the people who show up for you are not the ones you expected, but they are exactly the ones you need. Rachel and Joshua walked out of that reception as newlyweds, but they also walked out as survivors of a scheme that had been months in the making, crafted by someone who was supposed to welcome Rachel into the family. Instead, the caterer did that. A stranger with a phone and a conscience. Arthur Morrison did that. A man who never met his daughter-in-law but trusted his son's judgment enough to build a legal fortress around their future. Here's the thing about people like Patricia. They count on silence. They rely on embarrassment, on the instinct to smooth things over, on the fear of making a scene. Rachel could have swallowed her humiliation, avoided conflict, and let the toasts continue. But she didn't. She trusted a folded napkin, and that trust reshaped everything. So I'll leave you with this. Who in your life would hand you the napkin? And more importantly, would you have the courage to read it, even when it risks everything you thought was safe? Tell me your answer in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story stayed with you, share it with someone who might need to hear that they're not alone, and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, remember, sometimes the people you least expect are the ones who see you most clearly. And sometimes the greatest gift isn't what you're given, but who shows up when you need them most.